Everyone. It's good to see you and to see some new faces and to see so many of you back. So yeah, I hope you're all doing well. So we begin as always, Benum Christ in it. So I greet Christ in you, and I'm glad you're all here today. So let me call up our reading for today. All right. So let us pray. It is no longer I who live, but Christ in me. It is no longer I who live. It is no longer I. It is. Amen. All right, so our first reading today, for those of you who are following in the book, spans 27 and 28, pages 27 and 28. All right. As St. Augustine observes, the corporate nature of our deification is implicit in Paul's first encounter with the risen Christ. Before we are saints or servants, sisters or brothers, we are incorporated members of his body. Contemplative discipleship, or any form of authentic Christian vocation, cannot be fully realized apart from this theological foundation. For many of us, our first encounter with Christ is as a historical figure whose word we hear through the gospel, but whose living presence remains elusive. A word that demands we go places we would rather not go, transgress boundaries that otherwise provide us a sense of safety and identity, and keep vigil in the midst of the world's darkness. We may well find ourselves drawn to this word, even as we continue to resist it as foreign and threatening. Even Paul initially found the nascent church threatening to his own religious identity and sought to suppress its message. Recall that according to Acts, Saul approved the killing of the first Christian martyr, Stephen, and began ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. It was not until his transformative encounter with the risen Christ that Saul would be led toward a new interior awareness of himself as a member of Christ's body. It was sometime after his inner transformation that Saul adopted his Roman name, Paul, to better assimilate himself throughout the Gentile world. We see this in Acts 13:9. Okay. So our second reading comes from page 28 today. Remember that we are looking at the passage in Scripture from Acts in which Paul, or Saul, has his so-called Damascus experience, where he's somewhat knocked off his donkey and encounters the risen Christ, who asks, why do you persecute me? So that's the reflection we're looking at. So Paul's initial opposition to Christ exemplifies the false self and its agenda to keep Christ at a distance by reducing Christianity to a set of external rules and observances that we can fastidiously perform. all the while convincing ourselves of our rightness before God without ever entering into an interior relationship with the risen and indwelling Christ. As we will see in chapter 4, Paul's assertion that he was crucified with Christ is a necessary precursor to its corollary. It is no longer I who live, but Christ in me. We see that in Galatians 2:19 through 20. Life in Christ is always preceded by a kind of death to self, to one's passions and attachments. Indeed, the cross stands at the center of Christian asceticism because it exposes the false self and its tyrannical demands, so that dying to our attachments, Christ might rise in us. However, the Christian spiritual life is not reducible to ascetical practices any more than it is to the application of gospel teachings to our lives. If this were the case, Christianity would be tantamount to a reinvented Pharisaism, and Paul would just as well have remained Saul. The application of gospel teachings to our lives can only be a first and at best a rudimentary step toward the full flowering of contemplative discipleship realized as Christ alive in me. So there's a lot there we'll look at today. Okay, so our closing prayer then. Bind us, Lord, to one another as sinews bind our bodies. Stitch us, Lord, to one another with threads of kindness and human cords of love. Amen. Let's take a look then at some sharing time together. All right. I'm happy to repost or you reshare the screen share that if anybody needs to go back who doesn't have the book on them. But knowing then that this stems out of the a reflection on the experience of Saul on the so-called road to Damascus, I just open up the floor to any questions you have. Otherwise, I'm happy to make some comments. Let's start with any potential for questions or clarifications. Okay. All right. So I'm sorry, there's two folks raising their hand. Kathy, I just saw yours, and then Anna. Kathy, you want to start?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I really had like a bolt of lightning when I reread these paragraphs earlier this morning. Particularly the sentence, we may well find ourselves drawn to this word even as we continue to resist it as foreign and threatening. And I'm still in that Jacob wrestling with the angels mode. So, and that's definitely the tension with which I feel inside, because part of me is so drawn to this work, and yet like trying to do my daily centering prayer practice, it's like fireworks go off. It's like anything but sitting still doing that to allow that opening. But you're then in the next paragraph taking it to talking about the false self, and really what this deepening and opening really is having that die to let something greater flower. That, and as and that brought to mind Father Keating's writing about the psychology underlying centering prayer, where our false self consists of the needs for security, affection, and power or control. And definitely those are elements that I struggle with, especially having a deep history of trauma. So all the more those forces want to stay in control and not loose at all. So this was just really helpful to at least frame, give words to, give concept to what it is that this Jacob struggling with the angel for me might be about.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And what I love about your reflection is the idea that you're seeing your own struggle in Paul's struggle. So this becomes, in a sense, a metaphor even for the rest of us. So, you know, as much as it's his own personal experience, it's a way for us to reflect back in some, even in a decontextualized way, back. Oh yeah, this is my struggle as well. Some of you may know I did my graduate studies, or at least a lot of them, in Belgium. So I picked up Flemish when I was there, and there's a word, I guess it's not a lovely word, but I like it because it's one word in Flemish that we don't have a single word for, as far as I know, in English. And the word is bindingsangst. And it basically means in English, like a fear of commitment. Like, you know, it's typical among young people who want to get it, who are in love, but are fearing the connections and the attachments and the responsibility. So that's sort of bindingsangst is something I think we all have with Christ on some level, this sense of fearing what the real intimacy would look like and what that would ultimately demand of us, even as it ultimately frees and fulfills us. So we're all caught, I think, in that tension. I think in the evangelical world, that idea is captured by, you know, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. There's a real emphasis within that sort of Christian milieu around that deep, intimate relationship one is to have with Christ. And that's their way, I think, of speaking to that contemplative idea of that desire to move more deeply to that intimacy with the indwelling Christ. So we often, I think, indeed encounter Christ the way that Saul did, as somebody we want to push away or oppress or persecute, because the demands of that intimate life is just a lot more than many of us feel willing to give over, even though it really ultimately is tantamount to our spiritual freedom and liberation. You know, it's a universal struggle. So thanks, Kathy, for that. And Anna, sorry, I know your hand was up too.
Oh, okay. So I've been turning over the words that you said and almost answered my own question, but the process is like, okay, we have all the practices, we have the learnings, we do all of that, our meditation, and that's not it. That's
Right.
not it. But then it's like, well, how do we know when we've arrived, so to speak? But I guess we never arrive. But is there something that we can feel where we're, closer than not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, at least it's been my experience. So I don't want to universalize this. It may not be all of your experience, but that knowing comes cyclically rather than in a linear fashion, where there's moments where you can feel a real centeredness, as Keating would call it, or an expansiveness, or a groundedness, or connectedness. And other times where, I guess, like any relationship, even though the love is there, there's tension and that kind of thing. So in a sense, like any relationship, I think there are moments from our side anyway of more or less vulnerability to Christ, who I would argue remains infinitely available and vulnerable to us. And we kind of move in various degrees to that. And I think what we experience in that, although one of the concerns I have within sort of the way we're doing theology in a modern context is maybe an overemphasis on experientialism. So everything is reduced to my experience. And I think we have to use some caution around that. But on the other hand, one could argue that there is a certain experience of the grace, right? That we recognize as somehow deepest and revealing who we are in our deepest, truest self, and yet somehow emerging from a place that we didn't think we had the capacity to draw from ourselves. So there's some deeper place, and yet it's deep within us. And I think we could probably spend a whole session where everyone would be able to, in their own words, describe what that feels like, or what those moments of divine intimacy are like for them. And that's probably as different as we are. But there would also probably be these universal sinews or threads that we experience in that too. Love, connection, unity, those types of things would be typical words that you would hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let me then take a look at some of the points that I tried to make here and just spell them out a little bit. The one thing that I mentioned in the first paragraph that might be worth having a quick glance over is the idea that for many of us, our first encounter with Christ is as a historical figure whose word we hear through the gospel, but whose living presence remains elusive. And that is a word that demands we go places we would rather not go, transgress boundaries that otherwise provide us a sense of safety and identity, and keep vigil in the midst of the world's darkness. As we'll see, those things that I just listed there will come back at us toward the end of our fourth chapter as practices of asceticism. Those are practices that I will explore. What it means to be in solidarity with the world in love, what it means to transgress boundaries for the sake of social justice and so on, and what it means to keep vigil when we're powerless to do anything else. And so there's a sense in which, just like the interior Herod, who we'll also come to learn about, there is a resistance to Christ that we encounter very often. And I want to put that out there so that those of you who are in a place where you're grappling with or struggling with, who is this Christ? And for many of you in my own sort of pastoral ministry, Christ has felt for years like an obstacle rather than a way toward deeper spirituality. The idea of Christ has felt like a block. And it's only gradually that begins to sort of dissipate into a recognition of Christ as the way, the truth, the life, as it were, as the one through whom we encounter this sense of divine intimacy. So for those of you who are experiencing, like Saul, or feel threatened like Herod did, as we'll see, these are part of the normal human experiences of moving toward intimacy. And there could be many reasons why a number of us would feel a certain reticence or resistance to Christ because of experiences and so forth. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that for those of you who are on the path of exploring contemplative spirituality within a Christian context, that this is not uncommon to have to work through who is Christ versus who have you been told Christ is, and who is that depth of that living presence in you versus what you've been told to think or believe about that. And in many ways, the work of your prayer becomes, as Thomas Merton would say, the Spirit is who teaches us how to pray. And there's no human teacher that can actually do that. We can help point, we can help guide, but the real teacher is the Spirit who teaches us in the practice. And that Spirit leads us to Christ, as it were. And that's something we each have to journey on in our own way, just as Saul did. That said, I wanted to then sort of make the case, as I do, I believe it's in the next paragraph, that what I'm arguing for here or trying to articulate is that the spiritual life, as much as we may first encounter Christ as if an outsider, as an encounter with an other, maybe the holy other, that encounter with the numinous, with something that feels like it's even confronting us, outside of us, the way we might encounter someone on the street, right, or on a road. We encounter Christ very often as if from the outside, proclaimed in the gospel, in the faith of another person, hearing what we hear as an external reality. The spiritual journey is about that external encounter merging to the point where we recognize that, in fact, that Christ that appears to be on the outside is indeed, as Augustine would say, more interior than I am to myself. And that's the spiritual journey. It isn't that so much we are moving outward toward Christ, but Christ continues to penetrate to the deepest depths of who we are, or we recognize Christ in that place. And I think that there is a parallel to that in the way we understand the practice of our faith. And what I'd like to suggest is, while many people think of, or in all authenticity seek to apply, say, the teachings of the gospel to their lives. So, see the gospel text and then apply them, live in a certain behavioral way. I think that is still part and parcel of what it is to encounter Christ as if an outsider. The idea for the contemplative is not that we simply apply teachings as if from the outside that to which we try to conform, but rather that we realize the scriptures point to Christ within us, and it is the spiritual journey to get out of the way, not so that we can apply teachings, but so that Christ can indeed live within me, right? So that Christ can act within me. So that the Christian discipleship is about getting out of the way, removing the obstacles that prevent Christ from living fully, acting fully in me out into the world, rather than me trying to apply something as if external. And this is where I draw from Paul's saying in Galatians, it is no longer I who live, but Christ in me. This is, I think, what he's ultimately in his own experience pointing to. And of course, we know that if it is indeed Christ who will live in me in the fullest sense of that also requires a continual and perpetual death to oneself, right? That is the spiritual journey, that it is dying and rising, dying and rising, dying and rising. And I see, Craig, you have your hand up, so please go right ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
It seems that what you were just describing, what I sensed, is sort of the dilemma or the tension between centering prayer and Lectio Divina. In that, in centering prayer, you're trying to completely eliminate contact. I mean, get to a point of either total darkness or total light or whatever, but being free of what brings you to that point. And in Lectio, you need to focus on the textual reference. So I was just wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. That's a good question. My understanding of it would be, and this is not coming from any place of authority, it's how it's played a role in my own spiritual life, is that actually both Lectio and, say, centering prayer, or in my case, the use of the Jesus prayer, really do lead to the same place, insofar as, for me anyway, the four stages of Lectio. So starting with Lectio itself, or reading, and then the reading becoming oratio, or prayer leading to meditatio, right, or meditatio leading to contemplatio, or contemplation. That in many ways, even when the scriptural texts, rather than our prayer word or phrase, the prayer word and phrase function, and I think ultimately the same way the scriptural texts do, which is to begin with reading, lead to rumination in the heart, then lead to our own sort of silence around that, and then await for that fourth stage, contemplatio, which is, as you know, all of the teachers would say, is not something we can actively do. It becomes that place, as you're describing, of waiting for the gift or the grace of infused prayer, or the prayer of pure contemplation. So in many ways, I would argue, or at least it's been my experience, that both centering prayer and Lectio are sort of two roads to the same point. And let me just momentarily go back, because by pure chance, in a way, the opening prayer today in some ways exemplifies what I'm trying to say here. You see that I'm beginning with the passage that we cited, and through a process of Lectio, we could see here, we just start with that phrase, and the impact of it continues to sink us into a deeper and deeper reality of just what is, right? I am, right? And so in a way, that is a little encapsulation, I think, of how all Lectio works. We begin with a parable or a story of Jesus's healing or a miracle, and somehow from that we keep sinking deeper and deeper until we are led to just being with it. And that's that ultimate phase, which many would say is a grace in which we can itself achieve. So to that extent, I think it's been my experience that they do indeed lead to the same place, and that I would, in fact, encourage you all to ruminate, as Lectio Divina would sort of have us do, ruminate on these texts without a feeling of a need to push through, but to, as the teachings often say, to let what's on the page jump out at you, and to use that to just sit with and be with until you're led to that place of real silence. Does that make sense as a way of seeing those two things in a more unified way? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Other questions around that? Yeah, Gigi. You're still muted. Let me try to unmute you. There you go. Whoops.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah, the way this translates for my experience is the awareness that being a Christian and tuned into the gospel, I think there's so much in our lives that orient us towards what does God want me to do? How can I be responsive to God today? How can I please God? So that's outwardly focused, the gospel. What can I do that's consistent with the values of Jesus today? What does Jesus want me to do? Rather than an awareness that Jesus is in me and moving me, so to speak. It's not a matter of pleasing God. It's a matter of comfortably being with God and aware of that. And that's a real different focus. I don't even know if what I'm saying makes sense to you. It does to me. So I'm not out there pleasing God. I'm out there living with God within me. I'm in here. But the other thing is when Christ is in me and embodied in me and I in he, I'm still me. God is in Gigi differently than God is in Vincent or Anna or somebody else. And those are just my two realizations. It's not a matter of pleasing, it's a matter of being, but being with the beautiful playing out of who I am, realized fully who I am in Christ.
Thanks, Gigi. And John, I see your hand. Let me just respond real quickly, and then I'll come to your question. So Gigi, a couple of things. I think what you're pointing to also is what I try to say here, that I think many times the vast majority of Christians have, in essence, made Christianity a new form of Pharisaism. So, go to church once a week, follow these laws and practices, do this, fast here, practice this during Lent, on and on and on, all the laws and regulations. I think the impetus behind that is a desire for safety, right? Because we want to know that we're coloring within the lines, that our future well-being, spiritual well-being is safe. We know where the good, where the bad is, where the right, where the wrong, who's in, who's out. And so we tend to want to legalize. All of that tends to come out of a fear base, when in fact what we're being called to is that deep intimacy. And one of the things that is important about deification, and I know this will be important to you, Gigi, is the idea that the Christian insistence that my ultimate identity is born of God's own mind, right, from all eternity, that we are unique and unrepeatable throughout the history of the universe. There will never be another Gigi or Robin or Dwight or Vincent or anything like that. It will all be that there is a certain permanence, frankly, to this deepest identity, and that we come to that identity in the same moment that we come to the realization that we, as I say in another part of the book, we are never fully someone until we are someone in relation, right? The finger is a finger on the body of you, me, etc. The eye is an eye in the body. So the uniqueness that we all have rests, as Paul would say, in the body part. But the interrelationality that deification insists on is that body part does not stand by itself as a separate entity, but is united and interconnected relationally to the larger body. So the deeper I discover Christ in me, I'm actually discovering also at the same moment my deepest identity. Those two things are not opposites. So when we talk about dying to self so that Christ can rise in us, what we're talking about is dying to the illusion that as a hand, an eye, an ear, I am somehow independent. It's coming at once to the realization of my uniqueness as that member of the body, and at the same moment, the relational connection to the body itself, right? And this is what is sort of a Christian notion of relationship and unity looks like. It is always unity in relationality, never a dissolution of oneself, ultimately. So we'll come back to that many times throughout the reading of this book, but that sort of is the main idea there. And thank you for sharing that. Okay, sorry, John, I see your hand is up.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, this is you really have already commented on this, but it just was a revelation for me right now. There was something I was struggling with, and I don't remember a little bit in the past, but I know it had to do with a person and with either forgiving the person or trying to feel love for the person or feel, something I was resenting or whatever. And what I said to my spiritual director at the time, I said, I think it should be easy. I think I shouldn't have to struggle. I want it to be easy or something like that. And I mean, he actually laughed because, I mean, it does sound funny. Like I don't want to struggle. I want it to be easy for me to do this. And all of a sudden, when you were explaining this morning, I thought, oh, I know what I really meant. What I really meant was it was me trying to do this thing instead of Christ in me doing it, living within me. And that's that it came out as saying it should be easy. And that's that just sounds silly, but I think what I really meant was if I really got it as coming from the Christ in me, it would come naturally. And I wouldn't be struggling like this. I'm struggling because I'm trying to do it me myself. So is that right?
Yeah. I mean, and not only is it right, it absolutely reflects Paul's own experience in which he, if you really want to see how Paul fleshes out that very idea, if you read Romans chapter 7, you will see him really coming to the deep realization that what he's been trying to do all his life as a very faithful, well-intended, zealous Pharisee whose heart was really, really in the right place. He was trying to save himself. He was trying to do it. He wanted the control of that. And he felt, every time I mess up, if I just do another ritual, perform another sacrifice, do this, do that, I'll be right with God again. And this time I'm not going to mess it up. Until he finally realizes there's just no way I can do that. There's always an infraction, always a misjudgment, always an error. I'm finite, I'm human. I can't see all the complexities of how best to choose in this decision. I'm bound to do something that I shouldn't have, or say something that I shouldn't have, or hurt someone when I didn't mean to. And in a sense, then he says, well, how can I save myself? And his point ultimately is, well, I can't save myself. And all I can do is trust that it's the work of God in me who can sort of save me from this vicious cycle of trying to get out of my own way. And this indeed is what I think, the origins of that experience are what are described in Acts in this experience to Damascus, where he really has a shift in his understanding in relationship to his own ability to save himself versus the freedom that comes from recognizing I'm imperfect, I can't do this, but God can, and all I have to do is trust that happens, right? And we'll explore that section in Romans 7 later in the book a bit, so we'll come back to that. But I think this is exactly the same dynamic, if we want to think of it metaphorically, even in the story of Adam and Eve, who are made in the image and likeness of God, and yet strive to become God apart from God. I mean, that really is the essence of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that you'll know what God knows. You'll have divine wisdom. You'll be able to, you won't need God anymore because you'll have the capacity to decide for yourselves. And in a sense, that seduction to become God apart from God is the seduction we all feel. We want that relationship, but we want to stay in control. It's Bindingsangst, right? Notice that the language we use around love is, you don't walk into love, you don't sort of dance into love, you fall in love. It's messy, it's sloppy, it's awkward, you're out of control. You know, falling is not something you do usually intentionally. You're tripping, you're rolling over yourself, it's embarrassing, right? You can get hurt when you fall. So to use the term falling in love, and now we understand that experience of being so taken by your affection for someone that you can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't think, right? This terribly awkward moments. And in a sense that though describes the loss of control we all experience when love takes hold of us and carries us forward. And whether that's with a human being or in this case in the spiritual life, I think it's the same. And I think it's why we fear it so often. What will become of me if I really give my life to this person? That indeed is our freedom and joy and happiness, but yet it comes with a terrifying demand to let go of ego and replace that with love for another person, right? So no different than when we experience that with God, of course. Same dynamic.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, okay, let me just give a quick check.
Father,
Yes, last question.
We were talking earlier about resistance and all that. And when we live or when we come to practice our faith, perhaps in the beginning, it's mostly externals, but then there is a time that it has to become internalized and become part of our experience in faith as we grow in the spiritual journey. Because if it only remains external, we just go along and we rely on ourselves. In other words, it's our, but I think there is a point, or there was a point in my life that I interiorized my faith and I grew in faith. And it's that intimacy and that deep interior life that helps us and guides us. And it's the Spirit then that we rely on to help us in all our, in our entire way of living, in reality, and making decisions and so on. So it's not that then I feel at that time it's Christ living in me. It's no longer I, but it's Christ in me that's making the decisions. Does that explanation make sense?
Yeah, I think, Rosemary, I think you're exactly explaining that movement that I talk about in the paragraphs today, from sort of an external encounter or an application of the gospel to that real shift, to that interiorization. And I think when Jesus says, you know, if you're in the Spirit, no law can touch you, what he's talking about is not that we become a bunch of, you know, rebels who run around doing bad things, but rather we're so above doing just the Pharisaic right from wrong, good from bad, that we just are moved and living in love, right? In that movement of the Spirit, that laws become these sort of petty kindergarten ways of living the faith, as opposed to a real maturity by which I'm genuinely motivated by love in various circumstances, and that it's not about should or shouldn't, worthy or not worthy, trying to prove myself or not being proven before God. It just becomes about Christ living in me, about Christ, the Spirit, actually being present in and through me. You know, as John the Baptist says, he must grow greater, I must grow less. Right? Or John of the Cross using the analogy of a window, whereby the cleaner the window, the less smudges, which is our ego, the less you see the window and the more you see the light of Christ shining through that. So that interiorization is the journey we're all after, right? And we just move to that in our spiritual life.
But but we have to it's we have to trust God to help us and pray that we can interiorize this love and live it, because I think we cannot do it on our own. We'll get rid of our false self. We need God's help, and I think that comes through prayer.
Absolutely. And I think the kind of prayer we're talking about is the prayer that really emphasizes, as I say today in the chapter, dying to oneself that Christ might live in us. That is all born of the Spirit, right? It is all God's work within us.
Yeah.
And we don't have to worry about that piece. That's the beauty of it. We just need to allow the Master to do the work of the Master in us. And all we have to do is to make ourselves available to that grace. That's our job, is to just be present so that God can begin to do that work in us. Thank you for
It's
that.
the grace of God.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's beautifully said. All right. So I'm aware that we're at time. Let me quickly share with you. I'll stick around a bit as always, but I'll share with you the practice I'd like to invite you into this week. And then I'll stay to respond to some questions about last week's practice. So here's the invitation. I want you to reflect on a single part of your body throughout the day for a whole week. So pick a part of your body and let that become the focus of your noticing, right? Just notice it throughout the day. If you're thinking about your hand or a finger, notice how it holds and grips and grabs. Notice how you write. Notice how it moves and so forth. Notice where there might be pain in that part of your body. What does that part of your body offer to the rest of you? What does it enable you to do? To grip, to hold, to hug, to embrace, to fix, to turn, right? If we're talking about the hand, what does it allow you to do? And at the same time, ask, what does it need from the body? Right? So reflecting on a single part of who you are, your body, just notice it throughout the week. Just occasionally draw your attention to that piece and give thanks for that part of you, right? What does it offer the body? And what does it need from the body? Another question you could ask is, how does it interact with the body? What does your own body teach you about who you are then as a member of Christ's body? So how does this reflection open you to some insights about what it means for you to be a member of Christ's body, as this part of you you're reflecting on is a member of your own body? I'm going to leave that there for a moment. Okay, so that's for you all to think about. I think it would be a night to actually have the concrete incarnate self, to think about a body part that is actually you, as a way into a very, very gritty way into the question of, how am I a member of Christ's body? What do I offer the body? What do I need from the body of Christ? How do I interact with the community that is the body of Christ? All of these can become potential reflections we get from that. Okay. All right. Okay. So, I forgot, I'm sorry. I should go back to that and bring up what we did last week. And then, so for those of you who do need to go this morning, Benham Christinet, I thank you for being here. We'll spend some time now just talking a bit about last week's practice, and I'll open the floor to you. The last week's practice was as follows. I noted that this week's practice is as simple as it is difficult. Ask yourself this: in whom do I still persecute Christ today? Reflect on how this, in fact, harms you no less than inflicting injury on your own body. Consider, like Paul, what it might mean for you to awaken to this reality and to resolve to live in new relationship with this member, this person, this other member of the body of Christ, right? So this is coming out of Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, where he encounters the risen Christ, who then says to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And we see in that me an insight into deification. He doesn't say my people, my disciples, my followers, but me, recognizing implicitly members of his body in the people. And so as much as this week's invitation is to ask what a particular part of your body can teach you about your role in relationship with those around you, the question that grows also out of Paul's experience is that, why are you persecuting me? So who in your community, in your life, do you feel you persecute? And that's a tough question to ask, right? And then to consider, like Paul, what it might mean for us to waken up to this hostility or this tension in a particular relationship, and transform that. So it's a tough question. Any takers? Is it anything you came to within your own experience? Sharon, go right ahead.
Oh, the first word that comes to me is ugh.
Yeah, I know it.
So I had sorry, I kind of misplaced where I had written about this. Okay. So I felt when I read this that it reminded me of last time when you spoke of, at the very end, of family members or friends who have more rigid, literal, dogmatic approaches. And I really do call them Pharisees in my own head, right? So it's like a whole group that I am sort of persecuting. And it feels kind of funny because I'm persecuting the persecutors, basically. But all I know is that when I operate out of fear or anger towards this group, and that's part of the problem, I think, is when I put them into a group. But it does harm to me, for sure. Mentally, physically, emotionally, I'm stressed out. But your question was, the more I awaken to this reality, the more I feel being called to be some kind of a bridge, and learning how to relax in the tension of just about any opposite that I am bumping up into or rubbing up against. I've sort of named this finding a comfortable chair to sit in the discomfort and to slowly point the finger back at me and ask what aspect of my own nature is seeking to be made whole through this, and just go into a deep inquiry about it. So that's one end. But on the other end, I read Christ calling people, you brood of vipers. And my question is, is that something to be modeled? Is that a privilege of Christ alone? Is that the false, self in me that wants to just look for some kind of rationale for striking out or whatever? So that's basically what I'm left with is, and maybe this is a spoiler alert that you're going to actually show us later how to love the Pharisees. I don't know, but that's where I'm at with this question. So
Yeah. So, I just want to thank you for, for being the first, but also, just putting your vulnerability out there and really expressing that struggle. And, it is no secret that we are so divided in this country, and probably in many countries around the world ideologically, to the point where we've really dehumanized one another on all sides of our debates. And I do think that there's a number of people from various philosophical, ideological, political perspectives that are beginning more and more to see that and to struggle with that question as we continue to recognize this dehumanizing process. And I would venture, I'll speak for myself, that I know from experience the kind of judgment that you feel toward what you're calling Pharisees, and what probably there's some overlap with people I would comfortably want to put in that camp as a way of distancing them from me or asserting my certain spiritual or moral superiority over them. And all of that comes, from, in a sense, ego, right?
Mhm.
It is a difficult thing when it's one thing to theoretically talk about dying to yourself or crucifying yourself or taking up your cross, as we see in the gospel. But man, when it really comes to putting that into concrete reality, it can be very difficult, because on some sense you feel a sense of self-betrayal, like this issue of climate change is too important for me to pretend that I should compromise with people who believe it's a hoax, or that's the stakes are too high for that kind of compromise, right? There's that real grappling that I might have around those types of ideologies. On the other hand, anecdotally, and then I'll come to the other hands I see up, the University of San Francisco, where I work, is, as people might imagine, a profoundly progressive part of the world. And therefore, that gets reflected mostly in our faculty and staff, not necessarily from our student body, who come to us from all over the country and other parts of the world. But what I've noticed in my time there is that, we all like to pat ourselves on the back at the university for being, one of the most diverse campuses in the country. And we're all about the celebration of diversity and all about accepting the other and all about all of those politically correct things that make liberals feel so good about themselves. But for years, I've been asking the administration, the blind spot is that we are all good and wonderful and like to think of ourselves as so progressive because of this celebration of diversity. But in fact, the one blind spot we wear is that we refuse to celebrate ideological diversity.
Mhm.
And that is not just in theory, that is in who we hire, who we don't hire, who we exclude, right? The assumptions made by professors in the classroom with students who have much more conservative political ideologies and who have come to me, because I do try to be sensitive to this, and said, I don't even feel like I have a voice in the classroom because it's a liberal soapbox for my professor. So how this gets played out individually, how it gets played out socially, how it gets played out in the context of a university. One of the areas I think we can struggle with in our faith because I think it's where it really, the rubber meets the road, is ideological diversity. How do we love each other and get to the core of our humanity, even though we have radically different value systems that are trying to build our country or to build our faith tradition and so on. So I just say that to say, I understand how difficult it is, and I share many of your struggles. I'll come to other questions, and maybe toward the end, I can try to unify what people are saying in a broader response, but thank you, Sharon. Tissy, I think your hand was up, and then Christine.
Hello, Father Vincent.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. I really appreciate the fact that I can share, because talking helps me deepen my focus into what is meaningful for me.
Sure.
And in whom do I persecute Christ? Today, over the course of many years, over the course of growing up and through my contemplative life, I have realized that I have been persecuting everyone and myself, knowingly or unknowingly, throughout, at different levels in varying degrees. And how does this realization change me? I think I can no longer be the person where I was when I started my journey. So I am continuously changing my viewpoints, and my heart goes out to all. And I want to journey into a place where I can contain everyone in such a way that I no longer feel this, that knowingly and unknowingly I am persecuting others. So thank you.
Thanks, Tissy. It's a very, one of the reasons I always joke, but I'm serious, that there will never be a contemplative megachurch is because it really requires us to do this hard work. Spirituality is hard. We were talking about that a little earlier. Why does it have to be so hard? But it's hard because there's a lot of block that has to be chipped away for the paella to emerge, right? And so that's difficult, yeah. So thank you again for your honesty, Tissy. And Christine, thanks for waiting. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. And I'm sorry to be late today.
Oh, that's okay.
But in this assignment, I was aware, like Tissy, is it Tissy? That I persecute Christ and everyone in my judgmentalism. And this has been the hardest time these last 3 years with the person in the White House. And I just have had the hardest time embracing him. And I realized that being a 4 on the Enneagram, it's probably the narcissism that I see, that just pushes all my buttons. And so it's as though he's this big mirror, not just to the whole country or to the whole world, but to me personally. And in grappling with this, I'm thinking, well, what he's really demonstrating is a 2-year-old emotional level. And so in order to deal with that, I'm thinking, well, what if I embrace the 2-year-old within myself? That little narcissistic 2-year-old. Then I can embrace my own rejected self as well as and that is freeing, and I'm so glad for this assignment. Really, it's been transformative.
Thanks, Christine. I really appreciate that. I really do. It's good work, you know. Thank you. I think that there are times when judgment arises in my own mind. Could just be something that stays in my mind, and it could be something petty and stupid, like, you know, the way somebody's dressed or the way a student is behaving on campus or something immature like that or something. And I often pause and ask myself, just where did that just come from? What need did that serve? That thought, where did that come from? And I'm not always certain, to be honest with you. It just sort of, I think for whatever reason, there are times when our minds can tend toward negativity rather than positivity or optimism, tend toward building, tearing down rather than building up, even if it's just in the way we construct another person in our minds. And one of the things that I think we can begin to do is, you know, well, I'll, you know, in my own prayer life, so in the, you know, the invocation of the name of Jesus, which is my prayer, the Jesus prayer, or the prayer of the heart, as it's sometimes called, is, it can function in many, many different ways, but one of the ways it functions for me is as a filter. So that when those judgments arise, I put it through the filter of Christ, as it were. Let's say, okay, let's just see what happens to this judgment when I pass it through this filter. And of course, you know, it always comes back to recognizing in myself, or at least challenging within myself, what, as Keating would say, unmet need, or for power, control, comfort, right, security, isn't being met, that somehow makes me feel this judgment, which is in its own way a kind of aggression. I think judgment is aggression on many levels. So where does that, why am I being aggressive? What is the, to me, aggression is evoked by some kind of fear or threat. What is threatening about an undergraduate's bad hair, right? This is, you know, this is what sort of, why did I have to go there, right? As opposed to just say, wow, here's a young kid who's trying to express themselves and they're searching for their identity, and they're going to look back one day and say, why did I color my hair blue? That was kind of stupid. But in the meantime, it's who they are right now, and they're just searching for who they are in the world. Why does that have to become aggressive? Why does my interior response become aggressive toward that? I don't know the answer to that all the time, but when I filter it through Christ, it is disarmed, essentially. And I think somehow the interior work is learning, as Jesus did, even when aggression toward him was at its worst, to respond, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, becomes in many ways the ability to detach from judgment and move only in mercy. And one of the things, and then Robin, I'll come to your question. Thank you for your hand. We're going to explore all of this much more deeply in chapter 4. And because we're reading it so slowly, we're going to have, I think, a couple months of some intense exploration around unmooring and recognizing these demons in ourselves. But the beauty is that as we move through this together, the realization that none of us have a moral horse to ride in on, and that we all will, I think, discover in one another's experiences how much alike we are to those things. And so I hope we can move into that when it comes with great authenticity together. I think it'll be very liberating. So Robin, go right ahead.
How do you filter your judgment through Christ? Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah. So how do I filter my judgment through Christ?
Yeah.
So judgment and anger are examples of emotions that are distancing, right? That's just pop psychology. We know that, when we're hurt, to respond in anger is a way of not having to deal with the hurt, but to create sort of just a sort of facade or a fortress around that and push the person away who's caused us the hurt. And so if I'm in my own head, if there are judgments arising about an individual or a situation or whatever, to interrupt that flow, that stream of that rant with the Jesus prayer, right, in a sense confronts that tirade, if you want to call it that judgment with the reality of Christ, with the intimacy of Christ, with the recognition that what place does this have if I am Christ in the world? What place does this have in me? And what it does is it on the one hand, in a very pragmatic sense, interrupts the judgment itself as a thought, as a flow of thought, right? And confronts it instead as Christ confronted Saul on the road to Damascus with, why are you persecuting me? And then suddenly my whole sort of thought pattern is now coming out of a place of the heart rather than a place of judgment, which says, this person you are now judging interiorly is Christ in the world. And because I'm evoking the very Christ of which they are an extension, I'm somehow required to rethink, right? Or maybe to stop thinking and to move to an experience or move to a place of knowing this person is Christ. You are doing this to Christ. Why? Right? And once I begin to recognize that, I'm sort of led to a deeper place of realizing, well, it isn't just they're in some abstract way an extension of Christ, but as such, a member of my own body. We are members of that same body of Christ, and being aggressive toward them in my judgments, in a sense, is harming myself. So what it does is it allows me to begin moving from judgment to prayer, to, in a sense, contemplation, almost like, the person becomes Lectio. First, you're just sort of confronted, right, with the words on the page, with the individual before you. And then by evoking the Jesus prayer, you move to a prayerful reconsideration of that. And that leads to a deeper meditation on the fact that, this is also a member of Christ's body, meaning we are extensions of one another. And then to the grace of contemplatio, which is to say, this isn't about a thought process anymore at all. This is about Christ loving Christ. And that judgment turns not only to a recognition of a certain compassion for myself who feels triggered to judge, right? But also, and say, well, Vincent, where is that coming? What unmet need, what fear, what sense of moral superiority is that arising from? And then to show compassion on myself and have that flow to the person in whom I'm judging. And then this can all happen within a very brief span of time. but then it just shifts the relationship of knowing rather than thinking, of grace rather than judgment, right? Of compassion rather than aggression. Because I can't be praying that Jesus prayer and judging at the same time. The two become incompatible with one another. It's like you can't love God and money. You're going to love one and hate the other. The one confronts the other and forces you to say, which is it going to be? Is it your judgment or is it Christ? But in this moment, there can't be Herod and Christ. There can't be two kings right now in this kingdom. So which is it going to be? And by calling on the king, right? On the true king, the true heir, if you want to say, the Prince of Peace, I dethrone, in a sense, the Herod. And then I'm required to look at what it means to live and to embody that very kingdom that I'm claiming to profess. Okay, Kathy.
You know what I was thinking? There are sometimes you have to make a judgment, which may be negative, but it's necessary to reach a positive result. I don't know if I'm explaining, but it may be negative to the person at that time, but you're doing it to reach a positive result in the end by telling them. You may have, maybe if you would do it this way, it would work better for you or whatever. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but
you are. Yes, you are. And I think there's a difference between approaching someone with a loving intention to correct, better, improve, right? Deepen, and sometimes that might come in the way of an admonishment or in the way of, something that's really hard to talk about. We know that we've all been in these terrible situations, right, where we've had to really confront someone because of inappropriate behavior or something like this, and it's just awkward and painful all around. But that's so we can either do that out of a place of love or do that out of a place of anger or harshness or judgment, right, or moral superiority. And sometimes it is impossible to get another person to recognize that what you're doing is in fact a loving act and not just something not just a judgmental act. So all of this is very complicated when you're dealing with real world people in real world situations and so on. But yes, I think there are times when we have to lovingly, hopefully, but also to recognize that there are times that I've lashed out at people when a more gentle correction would have both achieved the goal and not done so in a hurtful way. And then you have to clean up that mess, so it's tough. Yeah, very, very difficult. But your premise, I think, is right, Rosemary. Francis, I see your hand up, but Kathy, did we lose you there for a minute? Okay.
Yeah, you did.
So Kathy,
okay.
And then we'll come to Francis. Yeah.
Thank you. So as I was trying to say, I did appreciate what you had to say about like how you use the Jesus prayer. But for me, there's one additional piece there that I'm wondering about how to work with. For me, my issue is with my brother. I've had difficulties with him for a number of years, and I've done therapy work with him. So it's not like I haven't tried to work on it, but it seems like in some respects it's getting worse instead of better. But the trouble is I can't identify what it is. That's the trouble. It's not like he's doing anything wrong. And it's really important for me to resolve it, because at 70 years old, I feel like part of my work now is resolving my relationships. So I continue to be in relationship with him and try and just be in friendly relationship with him, to really try and get to know him better and work internally and with professionals about working with what's inside. And where I'm coming to is that I do need to just continue to hold it in prayer. And it feels like that I just need to give it space to have whatever inside of me needs to work so that I can continue to do the Jesus prayer and the sit in the silence. But it feels like maybe part of it is beyond what I can do now. all I can do is continue to bring love to the situation and let whatever this is that I can't identify just work itself out as to whatever it is I need to know about myself or to resolve within myself. And by that happening, it's going to resolve whatever this is in relationship. So it feels like there's more complexity in this process, at least for me, around resolving a relationship in which I'm feeling like I'm doing some persecuting, even if I don't understand it.
You don't understand why. Yeah, let me very quickly, I'll try to offer just a couple of things that are coming up for me as I hear that, because I recognize what you're saying in certain dynamics I've dealt with in my own life. I think one approach you might consider is to notice how hard you're striving, which is noble, and to try to strive less and to allow grace to do its work. So in other words, what comes up for me is Paul's thing that has just been so important. This whole idea of I keep having this thorn in my side, Lord, take this thorn away. And the response keeps coming back, well, but my grace is enough for you. So this is a thorn, right? It's a thorny issue. It's a thorn. You don't even understand it. You're trying to resolve it. And there's what I hear is a very beautiful, well-intended, noble effort. And I think what might help you to move forward is to say, I can't, you must. This is a thorn. I need your grace. And to almost trust in the process of that grace working through you, if you can step back, laugh a little bit at yourself, laugh a little bit at your brother, laugh a little bit at the situation, and just say, I really don't understand this. All I know is a thorn in my side, and Lord, your grace needs to be enough for me right now. And by laughing, I mean, forgive yourself when those feelings come up, recognize them and just release them, whether it's through your own prayer, however that is, and to just say, whatever that judgment is or that irritation I feel around, this relationship right now, I'm just going to laugh at it and let it go. And I'm going to allow grace then to be the thing that rises up in me and allows itself to do the work of God. And I need to maybe stop striving as hard as I am. Maybe I'm trying too hard. And what God is asking for me is to recognize I can't fix all my problems. It's a thorn that grace itself will work its way into over time. And to trust that process in a way that doesn't try to push it too urgently, but just allows that room of stepping back and for grace to do its work. I don't want to say I'm requiring that. I'm just wondering if you give that some thought, if you might find that a way that will bring you some peace, both in the process, but also in trusting in the outcome as you move forward.
Trying too hard is a story of my life. So no, it's right
okay.
on.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I can be that way too. So good, Kathy. That's great. Yeah, good. I hope that get back to me on that, really, as you move in that direction. Francis, I saw your hand, and then I did see, was there another hand up? Okay, so Carol and then Gigi. Okay, so Francis first.
You touched on this briefly a minute ago, and that is that feeling of when you are kind of open and forgiving to someone else's point of view, and you actually are at the same time diminishing my own needs. And do you have any thoughts on how to, I think I tend to go sort of black or white. Mm-hmm. And have trouble holding both, I guess, is really what I need to do. And I was hoping maybe you could speak on that a little bit more of how do you be open and forgiving to, in my case, my husband who's divorcing me, but also stand up for my own needs and my own self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good and a very complex question. I think partly because the answer to it, I think, it's hard to give a general answer, and more an answer to a specific relationship in a specific situation, but let me at least affirm this much, that I think one can speak of genuine needs that you might have in this situation, particularly, let's say, around a divorce settlement, for example, right? And I would never advise, a member, a couple who's divorcing, to simply, not look out for their own particular interests in terms of what that life situation will look like at the end of that. What I might ask is that, how can you go about that in a way that is as conciliatory and amicable and loving and understanding? Because of course, in the midst of divorce, in most every case, I would imagine there's hurt feelings, senses of betrayal, all of those things that can really be very powerful. So in the midst of all of those feelings, maybe what I might suggest is, how do you at least raise in your own experience, where am I acting out of hurt and even potentially revenge, and where am I acting out of love and a genuine and authentic interest in the needs that I have, right? The post settlement of the divorce. And it becomes not so much about, I think, whether you look out for your own interests, which I think you need to, right? But how you do that, and how that becomes. Is there the possibility that at the end of the day, when the legalities are settled, there could be something conciliatory, there could be the rebuilding of a friendship, there could be less hostility, there could be movements toward forgiveness, and a life post-divorce that doesn't need to be one of perpetual anger, hostility, and resentment throughout the rest of your life. So can that inner healing begin in the way that I deal with how we move toward a place of protecting one another and the outcome of the legalities?
So, I mean, in one sense, it's easy for me to kind of keep going back there, because my most compelling motivation is, well, how ultimately does this affect our 15-year-old daughter? Mm-hmm. So that helps keep me grounded. Mm-hmm. But I also find that I don't think I'm attending enough to my own needs. Mm-hmm. That kind of is a lifelong thing of mine, that's what my mother would do, is my mother would do anything and everything that my father wanted. And no, really, that's some hyperbole, but I think that's one of my life works, is finding that balance between, like this week's reflection, both what does that body part contribute, but then what does that body part need? Right. And it's meant to be a symbiotic relationship. And how do you find that symbiotic aspect? Because I do tend to go black or white. Mm-hmm. So this is really lovely. And actually what Joan was saying earlier about, it should be easy. It should be easy to forgive. It should be easy to let go. It should be, this is the 100th time that's happened. Why am I still upset about it? Right. And, to some extent, turning it over to God rather than. And let me sort of, as a closing comment, and then Carol, I know you've been waiting, as just a closing comment to that, Francis, is to also suggest that in some ways, while forgiveness can feel difficult, if we step back, we also realize that holding on to anger, resentment, and all becomes a toxicity that we have to carry. It requires emotional, mental, psychological energy to keep giving that fuel. And that's very difficult in the midst of a divorce to confront yourself with and to expect you to be perfect at, right? But the question is, can you lay the foundations now so that when all of the legalities are settled, there is a platform by which you can both forgive yourself, forgive your former husband, and begin to potentially rebuild trust, friendship in a way for the sake of your daughter that would benefit her greatly.
And because you shared so many years with this person who clearly you loved, and to some degree I'm sure still do, to be able to just ask, what does that love look like after the divorce? How do we love each other in and through this and into a new way of being in relationship? Never easy. And again, particular to every couple, depending on the reasons for the divorce and the history of their relationship, but definitely not impossible. And to start by recognizing that the lack of forgiveness itself becomes very often the difficult thing to hold on to because of what it does to us more so than the other person.
Yeah. Well, and the two aspects of the anger being protective. And I think that I need to reflect on that aspect.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Thank you.
Thank
Carol.
you.
Yeah, of course.
Father, this has just been the most wonderful, wonderful discussion, and I could just continue to glean things for days on this, but thinking of it, bookending what Sharon started with about the difficulty with the brother and Kathy's fits me right in with all of that. So it's been so meaningful. I have a sibling who I grew up with, was very close to, and when my mother died, this is not unusual, huge rifts over things, and I take responsibility for some of it. Anyway, I have tried for years, because this is well over 12 years ago, to repair that relationship. Now, as Sharon's family, this sibling, they're very, very conservative, very literal interpretation, fundamentalist in their interpretation. So they decided to just, in essence, shun me as if an Amish person would be shunned from the family. And being a blooming 2 on the Enneagram, it's really hit me. And over the years, I've tried so hard to repair that relationship. I finally had to step back through counseling and spiritual direction, so forth, to just put it in God's hands and quit trying for me to be able to repair this relationship. It was like the thorn in the side. I've had to really, and sometimes I have real peace about it. I'm able to let go and put it in God's hands. And I also have to remind myself that while I live, I may never see a resolution to this rift, that I may not know this resolution until I die and meet whatever God has for us in the aftermath. So that being said, I just thank you all. And if you have some thoughts on that, Father, I surely appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's a good it's a good ballast and counterpoint in a sense, or it brings sort of in many ways the argument or the discussion full circle, in that I do think that in the complexity of life, so first of all, let me say this: forgiveness, as you probably have thought through yourselves, forgiveness only requires one person. Reconciliation requires both. So Jesus says, we're to forgive. He doesn't say we're necessarily always to reconcile, simply because that's impossible, because you cannot require another person or group or family member to extend that olive branch and to begin to repair a relationship. But you can forgive them nonetheless from within your own perspective. And sometimes through any number of reasons, to use your specific example, Carol, if there is a real strong ideological bent, which makes that reconciliation on their part impossible, because somehow they would feel they are betraying some sense of who they are by associating with you, or whatever is motivating them for that, or potentially through various mental or emotional illness makes a person, just too toxic to be around, or too harmful psychologically or emotionally. The question is, how and when is it appropriate to create boundaries in a loving way that protect us from that, right? And I think we have, to some degree, a responsibility to take that seriously. There are times when repairing a relationship isn't possible because of factors beyond our control. But again, the question then becomes, how do we love that person even with that boundary in place? And how perhaps does that boundary allow us and help us to love them more deeply than we could if we were constantly engaging in toxic battles and arguments and sort of confrontations? So one of the, while we can think theoretically through what it means to love everyone and what it means to be Christ in the world, and that becomes our goal, even our starting point, but also our telos, that ultimate thing we seek, it all gets concretized. And perhaps to come back then to, the earlier comment about Jesus, turning over tables in the temple, or, crying out, you hypocrites, you whitewashed tombs. I mean, is this a sort of righteous anger? Is he establishing a certain boundary with those who he needs to shake up because of their complacency, their hypocrisy, their spiritual blindness? Yeah, potential, but it shows you how difficult. There's many times students who are reading the Gospel of Mark in my class for the first time have literally come back and said, wow, he can be a pretty mean dude. Like, we had no idea how harsh and really direct he could be with his opponents. And there's that. So where does the beauty of the contemplative life and what it calls us to meet the reality of real relationships, real ideological confrontations, real emotional, mental, sickness, and all of those things that we have to somehow deal with? And I think the end of the day, we have to come back to asking ourselves, where is my judgment? Where am I acting out of love and compassion? And where has my unmet needs, my ego kicked in and now motivating my response? And there are times, to come to your point, Carol, where if you're part of a family who is rejecting you and you have tried with a full heart to reconcile and there's no willingness, the invitation for you may be to, again, as we were talking even earlier, to let go of trying, to allow grace to do its work in you, to allow the distance to be there, but to allow it to be one of peace and not built up resentment, one of forgiveness and one of an open door, even if they're not willing to walk through it. That holding that posture of openness and vulnerability, in some cases, I think is the best we can do. And to just know that as long as I'm not barring the door with resentment and anger and built up fears and holding that place of vulnerability open, then I'm allowing grace to do its work. And in time, you have to just see where that goes. It's tough. Yeah. Sharon, I just see your nailing question. Is the metaphorical turning over of the tables an appropriate response? Well, very quickly to that, and then we can close on that point. I don't think that the turning over the tables was just a moment of Jesus, losing it. I don't think it's an expression of him just having a temper tantrum. I think this was, he understood what it meant to be a prophetic figure in his lifetime. And he understood that prophetic actions can have very disturbing, but mind-altering, heart-altering effects. I think, he had long meditated and planned on doing that and was looking for the right moment, and what better time than as everybody's going up, for the feast. So I think this, whatever he did in turning over the tables was not just him flying off the handle in a moment of rage, but a very planned, prophetic, public act intended to shock, intended to force a sort of awakening to the corruption of the temple at the time in a way that was not going to, gently walk around or skirt the issue. And so is there room for public acts of prophetic resistance? Absolutely, I think there is. I think sometimes we're called to that. So I don't think this was just an act of violence. I think this wasn't even really an act of violence as much as an act of irritation. I mean, he didn't attack people. He wasn't aggressive toward anyone. He was simply and very directly exposing the corruption that everybody else was turning the other cheek and looking past. And I think when you look at these very harsh statements that he has against those who were confronting him, in many ways, they're playing the same role, just as his parables are meant to shock us. You know, he was very good at shock value, whereby, oh, we have the story and it's going along and everything seems right. And all of a sudden you're like, wait, what? He did what? Why would he do that? How could he do that? That doesn't sound right. What about the other brother? Well, he had his do. And so it forces us to sort of break through our self-centered complacency and look beyond into what the breaking in of the kingdom looks like, into the world, into our hearts, into the temple precincts, into the boundaries we build ideologically, politically, spiritually against others. And sometimes, you know, we've grown up in a generation of, you know, nurturing the inner child, but at some point the inner child needs to grow up. And sometimes you've got to uproot those things in you that just are destructive to yourself and other people, like weeding a garden. You know, you've got to pull those out because they're sucking the life out of everything else in your garden that you're trying to cultivate. So sometimes you just can't gently talk to the weed and say, hey, would you mind picking up your roots and moving over to the other side of the yard? You have to yank that thing out, right? And there's a certain degree of aggression, if you want to say, or real exertion in that. And I think this is what Jesus understood, how to shake us up, not just coddle us. We need to be particularly cautious of how we do that because of the potential for self-righteousness and for acting out of ego framework versus love and compassion. And it's often, I think, a very fine line. But the truth be told, that when we are taking these practices and bringing them to bear on real, concrete, real world relationships, there's a complexity there that requires us to be interrogate ourselves with deep authenticity, but also forgive ourselves when we're imperfect at it. Okay. So very good. We're going to have plenty of time to continue to look at these questions as we look at chapter 4. But it's hopeful to me that you guys are so willing to do this beautiful work, because it really is in many ways a part and parcel of our contemplative practice, to be able to really interrogate ourselves, knowing that we do so, by the way, before God, who loves us infinitely and with mercy, and who stands ready to embrace us and only needs us to be able to forgive ourselves, right, as a start. So good work. Thank you all. I'm sorry for keeping you so late. Okay, guys, so I'm going to just do a quick screenshot here for some of the last remaining comments that are coming in. I'll have a look at those and then maybe reflect on that next week. So Ben and Christina, thank you all so much for being with me today and for being with each other and for setting such a beautiful example of being vulnerable. All right, God bless you, and stay healthy and take good care of yourselves, okay?